So, with Dragon Age Origins The Veilguard, I put up my video Dragon Age The Veilguard as a failure. For me, it was a personal failure, just on that note. But it seems to be becoming a commercial failure as well, and that seems to be becoming obvious. The further away we get from that release date, the more data that is coming in. Hundreds of thousands of refunds have been issued. This is just on PC, by the way, according to Steam's information. And furthermore as well, given the long and protracted development cycle of this game, you're talking about, an in excess of 4 to 5 million units they would have to push across all platforms, which of course may be doable in a year, perhaps a year and a half, perhaps 2 years. Given the figures that we have now of the concurrent players, it doesn't look like it's doing very well at all. Again, the mythical modern audience, it doesn't seem to be present here. Again, like most of the other modern audience flops, should we say. So I received quite a litany of comments on my previous video, and I found them very diverse, interesting. By diverse, I mean you had everything from political discussion to discussion on just in general the gaming industry and the entertainment industry, and I engaged with detractors and also those who were in favour or supportive of my video, and I found it very engaging. I found it quite worthwhile to discuss with both camps. But what I've found as well, so I also checked the Steam reviews, it seems as though they are switching the recommended tags for what appears to be, by the content of the review, a negative review. So they're artificially inflating the numbers that way, the positive score that way. Moreover as well, it seems as though, now this is just reports, I haven't done this myself, I probably will in the next hour or so. People have been attempting to leave negative reviews, and Steam has impeded them from doing so. They have been actively stopped from posting that review. It seems it's down to some sort of error. From one screenshot I see here, sorry we couldn't submit your review, please try again later. And the user stated, this is on Twitter, they locked the user reviews, I wonder why. So, as we see there is clear artificial inflation of this game. This game cannot die because, remember, as the Joker stated when he burned that pile of money, it isn't about the money, it's about sending a message. So ultimately this is what seems to be driving this game, driving this agenda, driving these deceptive anti-consumer practices. So, I mean, we really are not even tiptoeing into a world akin to 1984, we are full steam ahead. People can have a difference of opinion, and that's what I've noticed with some detractors in the comments on the last video, that we can have a difference of opinion, but it doesn't mean that we have to hate one another. There was one individual that actually stated, he used the word, you people, referring to myself, infect YouTube. So I mentioned, well, by you utilising that word infect, you're almost implying intent to incite, right? To incite violence or incite hatred against me and against people who are of like mind, right? Just because they have a difference of opinion when they came into contact with this game. Now, of course, don't get me wrong, I'm not naive, I'm well aware that this is at the fore of the culture war, so to say. I mean, there's not really any war to be had. The West does not have a culture, it's dead. It died about 10 years ago. It's gone. And I don't mean to sound depressive or negative in that statement and that assertion, but it's quite clear to see. I mean, you only have to look at the demographic trajectory alone to see that hell, it doesn't really even matter which side wins out of this phony conflict. Both of us are going to lose. We're going to lose our way of life, so on and so forth. So I'm well aware that even video games have become, the new battleground for the culture war to be waged upon. But it really is quite alarming, and it's a testament to human nature how quickly people will just simply abandon their humanity and their empathy. When I make videos, I have no ill will against anyone else. I'm merely discussing issues. I'm very much interested in anthropology, philosophy, sociology, political theory, and my first book was on anacyclosis. That is the rise and fall of civilizations, political evolution. That's what I'm interested in. And of course, everything going on around this game, and this game being a microcosm of the larger macrocosmic culture war, and really what is the death throes, I think, of Western civilization. Of course, from a personal level, I find it deeply worrying. Deeply worrying. Terrifying, actually. Because the way that people have this reckless abandon to simply give up their humanity because they subscribe to a certain political ideology, or they believe that they have this identity, be it on the right or the left, and that political ideology becomes the full totality of who they are. They wear that as some sort of political uniform. And everyone else that does not subscribe to their quixotic or utopian or absolutely impractical belief structure is somehow a heretic, is somehow immoral, is somehow evil incarnate. I mean, we really have to get beyond this very black and white thinking, this really what is not very sophisticated thinking that's irrational, thinking that's far more primitive than people actually think. It's very tribalistic, very tribalistic. You're either with me or you're with the enemy. You either believe 100% what I believe or you're with the enemy. I mean, this sort of purity spiral will only lead to one thing, and that is the absolute division of society and the destruction of it. And this is the ironic thing. With the destruction of Western civilization actually comes the destruction of everything that both sides of the culture war believe. The stability goes, the material living standards go, the way of life goes, and all of the various rights that make this culture war and make these quixotic and emergent belief structures like gender diversity or whatever it may be, that make those things possible within the microcosm of Western civilization will also go. They will be resigned to the dustbin of history as soon as Western civilization is resigned to the dustbin of history. And people don't really seem to grasp that idea, that what you have is a very fragile social structure that upholds all of your rights, both on the left and on the right. So the more that we fight each other, the more that games like this come out, which only heighten divisiveness and heighten the chasmic divide between people, the more we are going to spiral into the death throes, civilizational death throes. And of course, this really all began within the early 2010s, with the likes of Anna Kasparian and what have you. And this idea of averting the male gaze, trying to put men off from sexually objectifying women. And that has brought us to the point now where you can't play a game as a female and look normatively feminine. You have to play as a masculinized female, I guess. Again, this is all to avert the male gaze, to ensure that females are not sexually objectified within their normative body type. I mean, look at The Last of Us Part 2. I mean, it's absolutely insane, the amount of masculinization of the female characters that took place in that game. And it almost feels as though you cannot be neutral in this ideological struggle. You have to pick a side. And I see that the left, just from my opinion, I mean, I'm neither right nor left. As I've mentioned, I look at this from a scholarly point of view. I write books on this. It's like a large-scale social experiment to me, from what I'm seeing. I understand the cyclical nature of history. Civilizations rise and fall, so I don't become completely entangled in the maelstrom of the culture war. But I find it completely terrifying, the way that the mentality of the mob, the mentality of the political ideologue, every facet of their life must become infused. It must become a living, breathing facsimile of their political identity. It is totally irrational. Totally irrational. That is for both the left and the right, but I've noticed that the left are more fervent in enforcing ideological conformity. That's from what I've seen. Now, there was several comments I want to get to, and they were all fantastic comments. Again, even the detractors. I learned a lot from reading the comments, and I tried to... People are still posting comments, funnily enough, and I tried to get to them all. There was one commenter, Rory Lol. The inability for the player and even villains in modern media to go against the narrative is very reminiscent of 1984. That is correct. I mean, you can't even be offensive in this game. It is a hand-holding exercise. It's puerile, juvenile. The puzzles, I say quote-quote puzzles, are completely brain-dead. I mean, it tells you a lot about how BioWare and their game designers view their audience. But yes, you can't be evil in the game. You have to take on this certain role. Of course, you can't even be unsupportive to certain characters in the game. The inoffensive nature of it is inauthentic. It writes like self-parody. And in doing so, from what I noticed, they seem to actually do more harm than good in disempowering, invalidating, and disenfranchising these groups who are part of these emerging, complex, extremely complex social issues. So they desire to virtue signal, but in doing so, to me, to a spectator, of course, it is the spectators who they're attempting to convert, essentially, to convert to a position of not just tolerance, but a position of acceptance and actually assimilation into this new paradigm of thinking. To me, as that spectator, it seems totally inauthentic. It actually, as I mentioned, it seems to make a mockery of the entire new paradigm of thinking upon gender and upon sexuality. And as you can clearly see, they're not naive. They would have known the type of response that this very direct and you could say obnoxiously placed elements that refer back to these, again, complex social issues would have generated this type of divisiveness, this type of, you could say, non-inclusivity. And I feel the way that they have introduced and shoehorned these social issues into this game feel very contrived. That's another thing that is quite jarring with the experience that I felt. And in that sense, it almost feels as though it's not for these ostensibly marginalised groups. It's not for their preference, it is for the potential of, again, assimilating and culturally appropriating spaces that belong to the prevailing and previous paradigm of thinking. This is a game of power. It's a game of thrones. It is very much an ideological battle. This is not a battle of humanitarianism. That is a mere guise. And of course, whenever one's enemy uses humanitarianism or injects it into the conversation, just know that there is duplicity afoot. It is usually because they seek to win the argument on moral grounds. Because what they are stating, again, without that veneer, that support of humanitarianism, would be clearly seen to be false, would be clearly seen to be deceitful, would be clearly seen to be, again, quixotic, idealistic, and utopian. Continuing on, In the book, the oppressive government seeks to make it impossible to even utter wrongthink by changing the language. Absolutely. And we see that today. The language is being abbreviated, it's being dumbed down. In fact, the people themselves are turning into sterile, blank canvases, tabula rasas, total automatons that have a less than optimal capability to express themselves because of the curtailment of language, the modification of language, the repealing of language, really. And of course, SMS, short-form content, all of that has produced that type of curtailment of the language and, of course, automaton-like thinking within the population. In our society, they just pretend it doesn't exist. Murder is bad, but not accepting someone's gender expression is literally unthinkable. I very much agree that the woke problem is a manufactured distraction to cover the fact that our economic future is being hollowed out by the top 0.1%. It's like they decided to give every village idiot a soapbox and megaphone to keep us occupied while they burglarise our collective houses. Genius. That is entirely what has happened here. BlackRock have funded these various games. What we have to remember is that EA is 10% owned by BlackRock. Now, of course, EA are a subsidiary of a larger company, which will probably be, to a greater extent, owned by BlackRock, perhaps, I don't know, 40-50%, and so on and so forth. I mean, ultimately, what it gets back to, if you trace it all the way back, you know, follow the money, BlackRock owns essentially 90 to 95% of all companies on the market. Why? Again, it's not about the money. It's about sending the message. It seems to be an artificial collapse of Western civilization. I mean, there's no other way to describe it, really. If anyone has a better explanation, I'm all ears. But ultimately, this just... even what you see with the rage bait, both on the left and the right, within the social commentators and game reviewers and such, both of them essentially are promoting distractionism and keeping us divided, keeping us at each other's throats, right? They don't want us to unite, because if the peasants are busily squabbling amongst each other, they're not going to oppose the tyrant king, right? They're not going to unify and resist. So they have a vested interest, BlackRock and the governments of the world, in promoting this type of ideology, this emergent, novel social ideology. That is why the likes of the Canadian government promote these companies. It's not because they really care about woke ideology or human rights. I mean, God, Western governments caring about human rights, I mean, it's laughable, right? Any government caring about human rights, laughable. Governments are imposed by force. They make decisions on a daily basis which are cold, calculating, and arguably psychopathic. They have no shred of care for human rights. They have the veneer that they care about human rights. But the reason they promote this is because it creates distractionism. It manufactures this type of vitriolic and divisive, polarizing debate.